The bet that changed everything. Andrew Kadeen had never lost a bet, not once in his 36 years of life. The CEO of Kadeen Capital, one of the most powerful investment firms on Wall Street, had built his empire on calculated risks, ruthless decisions, and an unshakable belief in his own superiority. Money, power, influence, he had it all. Life was a chessboard, and he was always 5 moves ahead. Every deal, every interaction, every conversation was a game he played to win. People were pieces, opportunities were strategies, and the ultimate goal was domination. That was why, on a warm Friday night, in an exclusive Manhattan club, surrounded by billionaires, socialites, and corporate heirs, Andrew sat with an air of unshakable confidence. He sipped a glass of 30-year-old scotch as the evening's laughter and conversation buzzed around him. Everything was predictable. Everything was under his control. Until Lawrence Berkeley smirked across the table and said something that made the air shift. "You always play it safe, Andy. You never take a bet unless you're sure you'll win." The men around them chuckled, but Andrew heard the challenge beneath the words. Lawrence Berkeley, the heir to an old money shipping empire, had been Andrew's rival since their college days at Harvard. Unlike Andrew, who had clawed his way up from nothing, Lawrence had been born into wealth. He moved through life with an entitled ease that Andrew despised. Their rivalry wasn't just about money. It was about proving who was superior. Andrew leaned back in his chair, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "I take bets that matter," he said smoothly. "There's no point in gambling if the outcome is worthless." Lawrence's smirk widened. "Then let's make it interesting." Andrew raised an eyebrow, waiting. "I bet you wouldn't last 6 months married to someone completely out of your world, someone who doesn't fit into your perfect, calculated life." Lawrence paused, letting the idea sink in before adding, "I bet you wouldn't marry a struggling woman with nothing. No connections, no money. Someone with real problems." The other men at the table laughed, shaking their heads. "That's ridiculous," one of them said. "Andrew wouldn't even date a woman who doesn't understand stock markets, let alone marry one." Andrew smirked. "You underestimate me, Lawrence." "Do I?" Lawrence leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with amusement. "Here's the deal. You find a woman who's struggling, really struggling. A widow, maybe. With kids, someone you wouldn't even look at twice in your world." He paused. "Marry her. Stay married for 6 months. Be a real husband to her. And if you do, I'll personally invest $50 million in Kadeen Capital." Silence fell over the table. The stakes were massive, even for men who played with billions. Andrew should have laughed it off. He should have waved his hand and dismissed it as foolishness. But something about the challenge burned in his chest. Maybe it was the way Lawrence looked at him, like he was incapable of something so simple. Maybe it was the thrill of proving him wrong. Maybe, deep down, it was boredom, because everything in Andrew's life had become too predictable. So, against all logic, Andrew smirked and held out his hand. "You've got a deal. The search for the perfect wife." Andrew wasted no time. He had his assistant discreetly compile a list of struggling single mothers, widows, and women in financial distress. He wasn't about to pick just anyone. He needed someone desperate enough to agree to a 6-month marriage contract without questions, but not someone too complicated to deal with. It wasn't about love or emotions. Those were distractions. This was a business deal, a strategic move to win. After 2 weeks of searching, his assistant, Jordan, walked into his office with a file in hand. "I think I found the perfect candidate," she said. Andrew barely glanced up. "Who?" Jordan set the file on his desk. "Her name is Evelyn Carter. She's 29, widowed for 2 years, pregnant, and she has 7 kids." That made Andrew pause. His head snapped up. 7 kids. Jordan nodded. Her husband died in a car accident, leaving her with nothing. She's been struggling ever since. Works 2 jobs just to keep them fed. They're about to be evicted from their apartment in Brooklyn. Andrew frowned. He had expected a widow with a couple of kids, not a woman running an entire orphanage. Jordan continued, "She's desperate, Andrew. If you offer financial security for her and her children, she might agree." Andrew flipped through the file, glancing at the attached photos. Evelyn Carter wasn't what he had expected. She wasn't polished or glamorous like the women he usually entertained. She had soft brown hair, tired eyes, and a quiet strength in her expression. She looked like someone who had seen hardship but refused to break. Something about that unsettled him. "Set up a meeting," he said. "Meeting Evelyn Carter." Evelyn sat across from Andrew in a high-end restaurant that she clearly didn't belong in. She wore a simple dress, and her fingers trembled slightly as she held her water glass. She had agreed to the meeting only because she was desperate. The eviction notice was final. She had less than a month before she and her kids were homeless. And now, a billionaire was offering her a marriage contract. It was absurd. It was insane. "And yet, you want me to marry you?" she asked, her voice wary. Andrew nodded. "It's a business arrangement. Nothing more." Evelyn studied him. "Why?" Andrew leaned back in his chair, giving her a measured look. "Let's just say it's a challenge. I need a wife for 6 months. You need financial security. We both get something out of it." Evelyn clenched her hands in her lap. "And my children, they'll be provided for. A house, stability, education, whatever they need." She swallowed hard. It sounded too good to be true. But what choice did she have? "You don't have to love me," Andrew added. "You just have to play the role." She looked away, her mind spinning. Marrying this stranger for money. It was something out of a bad movie. But for her children's sake, could she really say no? Finally, she exhaled. "All right." Andrew smirked. "Then we have a deal." He extended his hand, and after a brief hesitation, Evelyn shook it. Neither of them realized that this deal, this simple bet, was about to change everything. A deal with destiny. Evelyn Carter barely slept the night after shaking hands with Andrew Cadine. She lay in her cramped apartment, listening to the soft breathing of her children in the next room, her mind racing. What had she done? She had just agreed to marry a man she barely knew, a billionaire, no less, for reasons that made no logical sense. A bet, he had called it. A challenge. To him, this was just another business transaction, but to her, it was survival. Evelyn placed a hand on her growing belly, feeling the slight flutter of life inside her. She was carrying her late husband's final gift to her, and she had sworn to protect this baby, just as she had protected her other 7 children. And now, her best option for that protection was a man who didn't believe in love. A proposal unlike any other. The next morning, a sleek black car pulled up outside Evelyn's apartment building. It looked entirely out of place in the rundown Brooklyn neighborhood, where paint peeled from the walls and the sidewalks were cracked. She stepped outside, clutching the strap of her worn-out purse. The moment she did, the car door opened, and Andrew Cadine stepped out, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit that probably cost more than her rent for a year. His presence was commanding, cold, calculated. Evelyn had always imagined that rich men had an effortless charm, but Andrew's was different. He didn't try to impress her. He didn't need to. His confidence was built from years of knowing he was always the one in control. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice smooth but impersonal. Evelyn nodded stiffly. He gestured to the car. "Get in." Inside, the car smelled of expensive leather and something clean and crisp, his cologne perhaps. Andrew sat across from her, watching her with a sharp gaze that made her uneasy. "I have a contract," he said, pulling out a thick envelope. "It states our agreement in detail. We stay married for 6 months. In that time, you will live with me, play the role of my wife, and in return, I will provide financial security for you and your children. At the end of 6 months, we divorce, and you will receive a settlement that ensures you'll never have to struggle again. Evelyn took the envelope, her fingers trembling slightly. "What if I change my mind?" she asked quietly. Andrew's gaze darkened. "Then the deal is off, and you get nothing." Her stomach twisted. She hated that she needed this, hated that she was so desperate that she had to agree to something so cold, so transactional. She glanced at him. "And you? What do you get out of this?" Andrew's lips curled slightly. "A win." Evelyn exhaled. Of course, it was all just a game to him. She looked down at the contract. 6 months, a lifetime of security for her children. She took the pen and signed. A new life begins. The next 24 hours were a blur. Andrew moved fast. There was no engagement, no romance, just efficiency. He handled everything with the precision of a man closing a major business deal. Evelyn and her children were moved out of their tiny Brooklyn apartment and into a sprawling penthouse in the heart of Manhattan. It was the kind of place she had only seen in magazines. Floor-to-ceiling windows, furniture that looked too expensive to sit on, and an entire staff dedicated to catering to their every need. Her children, wide-eyed and stunned, ran through the enormous rooms in disbelief. Her youngest, Emily, tugged on Evelyn's hand and whispered, "Mommy, is this a dream?" Evelyn knelt down, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "No, sweetheart, this is real." And that terrified her. The billionaire and the children. Evelyn had assumed Andrew wouldn't care about her children. He had made it clear from the start that this was a marriage of convenience, not affection. But when he walked into the penthouse that evening and found 7 children staring at him like he was an alien, something in his expression shifted. The oldest 14-year-old Daniel stood with crossed arms, watching Andrew warily. "Are you going to be our new dad?" Daniel asked, his voice defiant. Andrew, who had been in boardrooms with the most ruthless businessmen in the world, seemed momentarily taken aback. He looked at Evelyn, then back at Daniel. "No," he said finally, "but I will be your mother's husband. And that means I will make sure you're all taken care of." Daniel didn't look convinced, but he didn't push further. The younger children, however, were less reserved. 5-year-old Lily tugged on Andrew's expensive suit, looking up at him with big, curious eyes. "Are you a prince?" she asked. Andrew blinked. "What?" Lily pointed at his suit. "You look like a prince, like in the movies." Evelyn nearly choked on her breath. She braced herself for Andrew's cold dismissal, but to her surprise, he crouched down to Lily's level and said, "I suppose you could say that." Lily grinned. "Do you have a castle?" Andrew smirked. "Something like that." Evelyn's chest tightened. This man, this arrogant, calculating billionaire, had just knelt down to humor a 5-year-old girl. And somehow that unsettled her more than anything else. Trouble in paradise. By the 3rd day, Evelyn realized that playing the role of Andrew Cadine's wife was going to be more difficult than she had thought. For one, the media was relentless. The moment news broke that the infamous billionaire had suddenly married a struggling widow with 7 children, reporters swarmed like sharks. The headlines were everywhere. "Billionaire Andrew Cadine weds a nobody. What's his real motive?" Cinderella story or business deal. Inside Andrew Cadine's shocking marriage. From rags to riches. Who is Evelyn Carter? Paparazzi followed them everywhere. Every time she stepped out, cameras flashed in her face. Every time she took her kids to the park, they were met with whispers and stares. But the real challenge wasn't the media. It was Andrew. At home, he was polite but distant. He barely spoke to her unless it was necessary. He spent most of his time working, locked away in his office or attending high-profile meetings. Evelyn felt like a guest in her own home. Late one night, she found herself in the enormous kitchen, unable to sleep. She was making tea when Andrew walked in, still dressed in his suit. He raised an eyebrow. "Can't sleep." She shook her head. He leaned against the counter, watching her. "You'll get used to this life." Evelyn stirred her tea. "Will I?" Andrew didn't answer. She looked up at him. "Why do you live like this?" His jaw tightened slightly. "Like what?" "Like nothing matters. Like people are just numbers on a balance sheet." Andrew's expression darkened. "Because that's how you win." Evelyn exhaled. "And what happens when there's nothing left to win?" For a moment, he didn't reply. Then he turned and walked away. Evelyn watched him go, realizing that she had just glimpsed something she wasn't supposed to see. Behind the ruthless businessman, behind a cold, calculating mask, Andrew Kadeen was empty. And somehow, that terrified her more than anything else. Cracks in the mask. Evelyn had never felt more out of place in her own life. It had been 2 weeks since her whirlwind marriage to Andrew Kadeen, and every morning she woke up wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. Her children were adjusting quickly to the new reality. They had gone from sharing a cramped 2-bedroom apartment to living in a penthouse so large it echoed when they ran through the halls. They had access to private tutors, a personal chef who made any meal they requested, and closets filled with clothes they had never dreamed of owning. To them, this was paradise. To Evelyn, it was suffocating. Andrew was a ghost in his own home. He was always working, always on the phone, always looking at the next deal, the next acquisition, the next move in the game. He treated their marriage exactly as he had described it. A business arrangement, nothing more. And yet, something about him didn't sit right with her. Because despite his carefully maintained distance, despite his insistence that emotions had no place in his world, Andrew Kadeen wasn't as unaffected as he pretended to be. A cold marriage in a warm home. Evelyn sat across from Andrew at the long dining table, the silence between them filled only by the soft clinking of silverware. Her children had already eaten and were playing in another room, leaving her alone with the man who was now legally her husband. Andrew barely acknowledged her as he scrolled through his phone with one hand and cut into his steak with the other. Evelyn set down her fork. "Do you ever take a break?" Andrew didn't look up. "I don't need one." She frowned. "Everyone needs a break." This time, he glanced at her, arching a single brow. "And what would I do with one?" Evelyn sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I don't know. Maybe spend time with your wife." At that, Andrew smirked. "I wasn't aware you wanted quality time." Evelyn crossed her arms. "I don't. But if we're going to convince the world that this marriage is real, maybe we should act like we don't despise each other." Andrew studied her for a moment before setting down his phone. "Fine. What do you suggest?" She hesitated. She hadn't expected him to actually agree. "Tomorrow, we take the kids out," she said finally. "Somewhere normal. No bodyguards, no luxury cars. Just something real." Andrew's jaw tightened slightly. "That's unnecessary." "It's completely necessary," Evelyn countered. "If we don't at least try to act like a family, people will start questioning this marriage." Andrew exhaled through his nose. Then, to her surprise, he gave a slight nod. "Fine." One afternoon, Evelyn hadn't expected him to give in so easily, and for the first time, she wondered if Andrew Kadeen was more human than he let on. A billionaire in a normal world. The next afternoon, Andrew Kadeen found himself in a place he had never imagined setting foot in. A public park. It was an ordinary weekend afternoon, the kind he had never experienced. Parents sat on benches, watching their children play. Kids screamed as they ran toward the swings and slides. The air smelled of popcorn and cotton candy from a nearby vendor. Andrew, dressed in his usual expensive suit, looked absurdly out of place. "Relax," Evelyn muttered beside him. "No one here is trying to make a deal with you." Andrew shot her a dry look. "I don't relax." "Yeah, I'm getting that," Evelyn said, shaking her head. Meanwhile, her children had already scattered. Lily and Emily ran toward the playground, while Daniel kept a cautious eye on them from a distance. Andrew watched as Lily grabbed his hand and dragged him toward the swings. "Come push me," she demanded. Andrew stiffened. I don't. Come on, just once. Evelyn hid a smile as Andrew sighed and followed Lily to the swings. He pushed her gently at first, looking almost confused by the whole experience. But then Lily giggled, tilting her head back in pure joy, and something flickered across Andrew's expression, something Evelyn couldn't quite place. For the first time, he looked unsure. And in that moment, Evelyn realized something important. Andrew Cadine had no idea how to be happy. The cracks in his armor. That night, Evelyn found Andrew in his home office, staring out the window at the city skyline. She leaned against the doorframe. You survived an entire afternoon in a public park. I'm impressed. Andrew didn't turn around. I don't see the appeal. Evelyn walked in, crossing her arms. You really don't know how to enjoy anything, do you? Andrew let out a short, humorless laugh. Enjoyment is a distraction. No, enjoyment is life. Andrew finally turned to face her. Do you think I got where I am by chasing happiness? Evelyn held his gaze. And do you think you'll stay where you are by running from it? Andrew didn't answer. Evelyn sighed, stepping closer. Look, I know this marriage is just a deal to you, but you don't have to spend the next 6 months acting like a machine. You're allowed to feel things. Andrew's jaw tightened. Feeling things gets people hurt. Evelyn tilted her head. And who hurt you? For a split second, something flashed in his eyes. Pain. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. That's none of your concern. Evelyn exhaled. Right. Of course. You're the great Andrew Cadine. Untouchable. Unshakable. She turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. But for what it's worth, my kids think you're pretty great, even if you don't. She walked out, leaving Andrew standing in the dim light of his office, staring at the door long after she was gone. And for the first time in years, he wasn't sure if he was still in control of the game. When a heart begins to thaw. The morning after their trip to the park, Andrew Cadine found himself doing something he hadn't done in years. He woke up late, not because he had forgotten to set an alarm. He never forgot. But because, for the first time in as long as he could remember, his mind hadn't been racing with numbers, deals, or strategies. Instead, his thoughts were tangled with something far more unsettling. Laughter. Lily's giggle as she swung higher and higher. The way Evelyn had smiled when she watched her children play. The feeling of tiny hands tugging on his suit, completely unconcerned with his wealth or power. Andrew sat up abruptly, scrubbing a hand over his face. This was a distraction. He had won every game he had ever played because he never allowed emotions to interfere with logic. But now, there was a new problem. He wasn't sure if he was playing the game or if the game was playing him. The unexpected invitation. That afternoon, Evelyn knocked on the door to Andrew's home office. He didn't look up from his laptop. What is it? She stepped inside, arms crossed. You've been hiding in here all day. Andrew barely glanced at her. I have work to do. Evelyn sighed. Of course you do. But guess what? People also eat dinner. With their families. Andrew finally looked up, his brows drawing together. And you should eat with us. Andrew stared at her as if she had just suggested he go skydiving without a parachute. That's unnecessary, he said. It's completely necessary, Evelyn countered, mimicking his tone. You want this marriage to look real. Then act like a husband. Sit at the table. Talk to the kids. Be present for more than 5 minutes. Andrew exhaled sharply. Evelyn. Andrew. She held his gaze, firm but not unkind. They like you. I don't know why, but they do. And whether you realize it or not, you like them too. Andrew's expression darkened. I don't do family dinners. Then start. Silence stretched between them. For a moment, Evelyn thought he would refuse. Then, to her surprise, Andrew shut his laptop with a quiet click. Fine. A seat at the table. Dinner in the Carter household. Or, as it was now, the Cadine household, was nothing like the stiff, formal meals Andrew was used to. Instead of quiet, there was chaos. Instead of neatly plated gourmet dishes, there were mashed potatoes flung across the table by a giggling 5-year-old. Instead of polite conversation, there was a 7-person debate about whether superheroes or dinosaurs were cooler. Andrew sat at the head of the table, watching the madness unfold around him with an expression of pure disbelief. Evelyn smirked. "What? Not what you expected." Andrew picked up his fork. "This is not how meals typically go." Evelyn arched a brow. "No. What do you talk about during your fancy billionaire dinners?" Andrew shrugged. "Stock markets, politics, business strategies." Across the table, Lily wrinkled her nose. "That sounds boring." Andrew exhaled. "It usually is." Evelyn studied him for a moment. "What about when you were a kid? Were your family dinners like this?" Andrew's hand tightened around his fork. For a split second, something flickered across his face. Something raw, something unguarded. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. "No," he said simply. Evelyn frowned. Before she could press further, Daniel, her eldest, leaned forward. "So, Andrew," he said, his voice carrying the sharpness of a teenager who wasn't entirely sure what to make of the man sitting at their table, "what exactly do you do?" Andrew took a sip of his wine. "I manage money." "That's vague." "It's accurate." Daniel narrowed his eyes. "Do you even like your job?" Andrew hesitated. It was a simple question, a logical one. But for some reason, he didn't have an answer. A ghost from the past. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Evelyn found Andrew standing in the dimly lit hallway, staring at an old family photo she had hung on the wall. It was a picture from 2 years ago, before her husband had died. Her late husband, James, had his arm around her, smiling, while the kids clung to them in various states of playfulness. Andrew's face was unreadable. Evelyn hesitated. "You don't have to do this, you know." Andrew turned slightly. "Do what?" "Pretend you belong here." She stepped closer. "You don't have to force yourself into something you don't want." Andrew's jaw clenched. "I made a bet, Evelyn, and I don't lose." She studied him. "Is that what this is? Just another game?" Andrew exhaled slowly. It was. And now, he didn't answer. Instead, he reached out and traced a finger along the edge of the picture frame, his expression unreadable. Evelyn watched him carefully. She had seen glimpses of it before, the cracks in his armor, the rare moments of hesitation. But tonight, for the first time, she saw something more. Loneliness. Not the kind that came from being physically alone, but the kind that settled deep into a person's bones, the kind that stayed, no matter how much money, power, or success they had. "Who taught you to live like this?" she asked softly. Andrew's hand dropped from the frame. "No one taught me. I survived." Evelyn exhaled. "There's a difference between surviving and living, Andrew." Silence stretched between them. Then, without another word, Andrew turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the penthouse. Evelyn let out a slow breath, pressing a hand to her growing belly. She had agreed to this marriage thinking Andrew Cadine was nothing more than a cold-hearted billionaire playing a game. But now she wasn't so sure. Because if there was one thing she had learned in life, it was this. The people who built the tallest walls were always the ones who were afraid of being seen. And for the first time since she had met him, Evelyn had seen Andrew Cadine, and he had no idea what to do about it. When walls begin to fall, Andrew Cadine was losing control. Not in the way he had lost deals before, because he never lost deals. Not in the way stocks fluctuated or markets crashed. This was different. This was something deeper, something personal, something terrifying. He had built his life on logic and power. He had conditioned himself to make decisions based on numbers, not emotions. He had walked through life untouched, unaffected. And yet here he was, standing in the middle of his own penthouse, surrounded by warmth, noise, and laughter. things that had no place in his world, things he didn't know how to handle. A night of unspoken truths. The sound of soft giggles pulled Andrew from his thoughts. It was past midnight, and the penthouse should have been quiet. But as he walked down the dimly lit hallway, he heard muffled voices coming from the children's bedroom. He paused at the door, listening. "Shut. You'll wake Mom," a small voice whispered. "I'm hungry," another whined. Andrew sighed, pushing open the door. 7 pairs of wide eyes snapped toward him, caught in the act. Lily, the 5-year-old, was sitting on the floor, clutching a pillow. Emily, the youngest, had her tiny fingers wrapped around a half-eaten cookie. Daniel, the oldest, stood near the window, arms crossed, acting like he wasn't part of whatever mischief was unfolding. Andrew raised an eyebrow. "Do you always have secret meetings at midnight?" Lily grinned. "Only when we're hungry." Andrew exhaled. "Come on." Emily's eyes widened. "Where?" "The kitchen. Midnight snacks and unlikely conversations." 15 minutes later, the Kadeen penthouse kitchen looked like a crime scene. Cereal boxes were open. Peanut butter and jelly smeared the counter. Lily had somehow gotten syrup on her face, and Daniel was attempting to pretend he wasn't enjoying himself. Andrew, still in his dress shirt and loosened tie, sat at the kitchen island, watching it all unfold. He should have stopped it, should have ordered them all back to bed. But instead, he grabbed a spoon and took a bite of cereal. Lily gasped. "You eat normal food." Andrew smirked. "What did you think I eat? Fancy billionaire stuff." Andrew pretended to consider this. Gold bars and diamonds, mostly. Emily's eyes widened. "Really?" Daniel groaned. "He's joking, Em." Andrew watched them, something in his chest tightening. This was ridiculous. He had spent his life making billion-dollar deals, shaping industries, controlling everything in his grasp. And yet, sitting here with a group of children, sharing cereal in the middle of the night, he felt something foreign, something unsettling, something dangerously close to peace, a memory best left buried. Evelyn found him sitting in the dark living room later that night. She had woken up to check on the kids and had been shocked to find Andrew Kadeen himself sitting at their kitchen island, surrounded by empty cereal bowls and a sticky countertop. Now she stood in the doorway, watching as he stared out at the city skyline, lost in thought. "That was unexpected," she said quietly. Andrew didn't look at her. "I don't know what you mean." Evelyn smirked, walking over to sit on the couch beside him. "I mean, you eating sugary cereal with a group of kids at midnight. That doesn't exactly scream cold-hearted billionaire." Andrew exhaled slowly. It was just cereal. Evelyn studied him. It was more than that. Silence stretched between them. Finally, Evelyn leaned back. "Did you ever do things like that as a kid?" Andrew's jaw tensed. "No." Evelyn frowned. "Not even once." Andrew hesitated. Then, in a voice so quiet she almost didn't hear it, he said, "My father didn't believe in wasting time." Evelyn's breath caught. Wasting time. Andrew finally looked at her, his expression unreadable. He believed emotions were distractions. That fun was for the weak. That life was meant to be won, not enjoyed. Evelyn's chest tightened. She had seen hints of this before. The way he carried himself, the way he spoke about relationships like transactions. But now she saw the full picture. Andrew Kadeen had never been a child. He had been raised to be a machine. Evelyn exhaled. "And you believed him?" Andrew looked back at the skyline. "I didn't have a choice." Evelyn swallowed the lump in her throat. She had lost a husband, but Andrew had lost something too, something just as important. His childhood, his ability to love freely, his understanding of what it meant to belong. Evelyn leaned forward, her voice soft. "You're allowed to live, Andrew. You don't have to prove anything anymore." Andrew was silent for a long time. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. It wasn't much, But it was a start, a war with himself. The next morning, Andrew found himself checking his watch, restless. Evelyn and the children were in the living room, playing a board game. The sound of laughter filled the penthouse. He should have left for the office an hour ago. He had meetings lined up, deals to close. And yet, he didn't move. His hand hovered over his phone, torn between answering an email or walking into that living room and sitting down at that ridiculous game board. For the first time in his life, he didn't know what to do. Because for the first time in his life, winning didn't feel as important as simply being there. And that terrified him.